Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a plunge into a grim, dark descent, really digging into the architecture of the soul. We're going to explore a terrifying philosophical fable deeply rooted in Nietzschean philosophy and philology. It's a Gothic fable that takes literally everything we think we know about liberation and, well, turns it completely on its head.
So, our journey begins as this small, jagged shadow shifts its weight. Imagine its eyes just gleaming with the sharp, bitter light of resentment. It's preparing to strip all our grand illusions completely bare, speaking in a voice that sounds like dry parchment tearing. It tells us, "You speak of nobility and soul-building as if you were architects of the divine, but I see only the damp rot of the basement."
This shadow is essentially offering us what it calls a monologue of cynical knowledge. It's setting the stage to prove something pretty bleak, that our highest, most celebrated archetypes, the hero, the artist, the pioneer, they aren't actually ascending to greatness. Nope, they're just taking different routes to the exact same destination, which is this cold, unyielding blue sepulcher.
And that brings us to our first concept, a horrific untying. Now, what you might boldly call a terrifying freedom is brutally redefined by the shadow as grausame Entbindung. To the philologist, this translates to a horrific untying. We're not talking about liberation here. This is a violent expulsion into a complete and lawless vacuum, a void that has absolutely no memory of your name. It just forgets you.
And the shadow is super insistent about this point. Dressing up our existential failures in beautiful, lofty philosophy, it doesn't actually save us from that lawless vacuum. We can call our actions soul-building all we want, but at the end of the day, the grand architecture of the soul is really just the damp rot in the basement of our own delusion.
Let's move on to look at the shared failures of the weaver and the hero.
First up, we examine the prophet of the empty chair, the master weaver. So, the German concept of Weltschmerz is usually seen as this noble, romantic world weariness, right? But the shadow inverts this entirely. The weaver's tragedy isn't weakness, it's actually the final, brutally honest realization that the king he wove for was a myth all along. His entire lifelong devotion was spent on a complete phantom.
And the text tells us that the weaver doesn't just fracture or break down when he discovers this empty throne. Instead, he completely aligns himself with the existential void. He essentially becomes an exposed instrument, one that correctly vibrates and resonates with the terrifying silence of an empty heaven.
Which brings us perfectly to their shared failure. Because while the weaver passively surrenders to the void, we look over to the heroic suicide of Siegfried. Siegfried literally shatters the anvil, which, ironically, was the only tool that actually gave him structure and form, all because he foolishly believes he's moving toward becoming the Übermensch. See, Siegfried thinks he's practicing amor fati, the love of his fate. But the shadow sees only a fool in the ice. By shattering his form, his grand act merely authors his own blue sepulcher. He's just inviting the lethal frost to be his new, much more indifferent master. And he freezes into a rigidity that is far more absolute than that heavy iron anvil he so proudly despised.
Next, we descend into the Emerald Dungeon.
Here, we meet the travelers who discover the verdant spark. But rather than being freed by it, they are actually the only ones wise enough to fear its radical autonomy. To them, the very act of becoming is viewed as a corruption. It's a choking multiplication that leads straight into the dizzying horror of the heights.
And then the shadow cynically poses this incredibly piercing question, one that really exposes the entire logic of the voluntary herd. It asks, why die rigid in the isolated frost, like our hero Siegfried, when you can choose to live rotten but warm and comfortable in the cage of the last man?
By actively building this emerald dungeon, they're utilizing the spirit of gravity to their advantage. They consciously choose a rotten, warm safety over the freezing terror of true freedom, successfully making their existence entirely predictable. They have literally built their own sepulcher, painted it green, and called it a sanctuary.
Now let's look to the cosmos at the Star Finder, a monument to eternal petrification.
If we look up from the dungeon to the stars, we find the obsidian nomad, or the Staraphanto. This figure is a literal monument to being eternally petrified. He tracks these old illusions across the galaxy for one specific, cowardly reason, simply so he never ever has to turn his gaze back to look at the living. The Staraphanto
is actually a linguistic manifestation of the soul's desire to be stone still, or star in German. He isn't some brave navigator of the future. He's a post-theological nomad wandering in a state of living death. He's achieved this voluntary petrification that spans entire galaxies, which really just proves that the stars are cold in different points of light that do not care one bit about your will to power.
Finally, we reach the diatribe of the shadow and the ritualistic polishing of the heavy shackles.
Here we encounter Der Geist-Schwere, the spirit of gravity. It's a crushing weight, and its absolute cruelty lies in the fact that it only increases its force the more you struggle against it. The hero, the weaver, the captive, they are all completely crushed by it. Why? Because the sheer fluidity of life is inherently seen as a threat that must be desperately managed with absolute rigidity and stagnation.
We witness this terrifying spectral transition. We see a living man in the past violently pushed through the horrific untying in the present, transforming the individual into a spectral captive in the future. You become the ghost, the phantom spirit who is forever aghast at the sheer terrifying scale of the void. And then the shadow reveals this deep, chilling philological connection. That desire to be stone still, the root word star, which we saw in the Starfinder, literally shares its ancient linguistic roots with the German word for expiration and death, starben. Think about that. Paralysis and death are, linguistically and philosophically, the exact same thing.
Because struggling against gravity only makes it heavier, the shadow frames liberation as an absolute illusion. Instead, it suggests a grim step-by-step ritual. First, submit to the spirit of gravity. Second, embrace the heavy anchor that pulls you down. And third, conclude that the only honest act left to us is to lovingly polish our former shackles as a twisted religious devotion.
So we're left with this chilling realization. The heavy anchor dragging us into the abyss, it's actually the only mercy we possess. It is the stone that finally grants us the stagnant, unmoving peace of the dead, essentially saving us from the terror of true freedom. I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought. When confronted with the stark reality of the horrific untying, what will you choose? Will you continue to uselessly struggle against the crushing weight of the spirit of gravity, or will you accept the anchor, give in to the void, and lovingly polish your shackles within the cold, silent walls of the blue's sepulchre?